When you deploy a static site like Gatsby or Next.js with Cloud 66, you can use what we call traffic rules. Now, any website or service that will deploy static sites will give you some sort of control over how traffic is redirected or rewritten. And usually those come in forms of a YAML file, a TOML file, any file, or some sort of static file that you have to explicitly specify roles like redirects and rewrites. At Cloud 66 for static sites, we treat this slightly differently when we give you more flexibility around how you can treat your traffic and how you can send it in different directions. There are four main sets of traffic redirection rules or traffic shaping rules, I should say, for Cloud 66: redirect, rewrite, block, and header. Starting with redirect. Redirect is as the name suggests, can redirect traffic from one URL to another one. This is very useful when you have an existing site and you don't want to lose SEO or inbound traffic that you don't have control over where the link is created to your website by redirecting them to a new URL or a new page. Rewrite rules are useful when you want to rewrite a URL to add, for example, a parameter, a folder, a query, or a file name to the end of your URL. For example, if you have acme.com / you might want to add acme.com / index HTML to the end of your URL so that file actually exists instead of just hitting the root of a folder. Block access, as the name suggests, restricts access to certain pages or subsets of your file based on the conditions, and we can get to how you can define those conditions. And header rule is where you can add or remove or change a header, an HTTP header, based on different conditions and with different values as the traffic gets redirected to your website, and you can use that effectively. So let's start with with one of the rules, for example, a rewrite rule that I have here. Now, the biggest thing that you see here, the difference here that you see with pretty much other ways of writing a rewrite for a static site, is that here you can use regex and you can use named parameters for regex. Now, this on the surface looks like a complicated regex, but it's actually very simple. What we're saying here is that we have a named parameter called path, then we have another name parameter called leaf, and then we have the query, essentially path, file name, and query. This is the start of the string, and this is the end of the string. And we want to rewrite it in the form of path, leaf, index HTML, and then query. Essentially what we're doing here is we're reconstructing what the user enters into their address bar in the browser and append an index HTML file name to the end of it without losing what comes after that in terms of the query strings. So as you can see here, it's a very powerful way of writing queries to rewrite a traffic that comes to your site. You can use exactly the same thing for redirects, and that's also very easy to do. Now here you see that we have an option in the example. We have an option for when, as in when we want this rule to apply. All the commands that you can do with traffic rules for static sites will have this option of when, which you can define a condition for. Now I'll get to this, how these conditions are defined and how powerful they can be. Another example is a header traffic rule. So a header traffic rule here, as you can see, what we're saying is that when the country of origin is GB, Great Britain, I want to add a header, an HTTP header that says GB yes. And I might want to use that later on somewhere in my application, in my browser, payload, or somewhere else where I make a decision based on what to do with this piece of information. Again, you can have add an HTTP header. You can remove an HTTP or a bunch of HTTP headers from your payload based on some condition. And you can change an existing HTTP header based on some conditions to a value. Now, how do we know what to do and how to write a condition? So I'm going to head to our help site, and here you can see an example of a payload that comes your way when you're writing a traffic rule. So here, as you would imagine, this is my request, and these are the things that you would usually expect to exist in a payload for a request. But then this is augmented with a bunch of other information. For example, the origin of your traffic, and that includes the service provider, city, continent, country, IP address, latitude and longitude, and time zone. for your origin. So these could be very useful in detecting and deciding what you want to do with the traffic. For example, send them to different languages or translations of your site, or block access when it comes from a certain country. And the other part of the payload augmentation or extra data that we add to any piece of traffic that comes to your static site is user agent. So what we do is that we get the user agent, the raw user agent that your browser sends, and we parse it against a vast database of devices, OSs, and browsers. And we add that information here. So you can decide if your traffic is coming from a mobile, or whether it's a Mac or an Apple device as opposed to a Windows device, or what kind of a browser and what version of that browser you're using or users using, so you can shape or redirect or block access or add another header to that. And you can use any of these to add to the header. For example, you can take the IP address and add it to the header to do something with it. Or you can say, I have a header as a Chrome, and I'm going to add it, information as a Chrome, and I can add it as a header, HTTP header, to use it there. There's other things that you can do here, as well as the regex and the payload. But we also have traffic functions that you can use. So there's a lot of functions that you can write. For example, taking the character index of something from a string. For example, here we just finding a piece of a string from within the payload. Last index, and there's a lot of different functions that you can use: trim, ASCII upper, lower, all those sort of things that you can use in order to write very effective conditions. The last piece of the traffic rules is the order they are applied. So one of the things that you can do is that you can write these rules, but you can change the order of how they are applied. So you might want to do something, add a header, and then check that header in the next rule to make a decision based on the existence or the value of that header. And one more thing here is the status of a rule. So one thing I can do is that I can write a rule and I can set its status to test. This means the rule is not really applied to the traffic. For example, if it's a block rule, it's not going to block traffic really. But when I set it to test, I can see that in the live logs view of my application to see how it behaves before I set it to live. This is very useful if you have a complicated rule that you want to make sure it works effectively and efficiently and as you wish before setting it to live. So you can use that test status and look at the live logs for that. We think these are really, really useful features and very powerful features that you can use for your static sites.